Okay, welcome everyone to the November 5th SIG Apps meeting. My name is Adnan Abdul Hussain and I'll be hosting us through this today. I'm going to paste the link to the agenda if you want to follow along. And the first thing we have today is an announcement. So if you're planning to go to KubeCon in Seattle in December, you should look into booking your hotel now. I think, Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, but all the conference hotels are booked out at this point.
Yes, I believe so. I looked into that earlier, or I should say middle of last week, and I think they were all booked up, but there are other hotels within the same distance. So get it before those are booked. I want to say this KubeCon is going to be the biggest yet. And I've heard numbers that I want to wait to hear because it's many, many more than I've been at a conference at. So it's going to be huge.
Exciting. And there will be sessions for SIG Apps. So there's going to be a SIG Apps intro session and also a deep dive for us to all meet and greet. So if you are going to KubeCon Seattle, see you there. So we don't have any demos today, so we'll skip straight to discussion topics here. If anyone wants to do a kind of impromptu demo later, when we get to the open discussion, that would be cool. So discussion topic, we have KubeCon Shanghai coming up, and I think, let me just grab the dates. I think it was November 13th. Yeah, November 13th to 15th. And we were wondering whether it makes sense to have SIG Apps meetings around it, and how many people from this group are actually going to KubeCon Shanghai.
So whoever's name was the hash in text and said, I'll be there, have no idea who you are. But if you right click on your name, you can rename it too. But at least okay, one person will be there.
So we usually, around KubeCons, we would usually skip the meeting of the week of KubeCon and the week after to give everyone a break. So that would be the next 2 weeks of SIG Apps that we would skip for that.
Adnan, we've got one person. That's it. We might want to also hit the mailing list on this one. We may, if we've got topics, we may keep it on.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Let's check the mailing list. Okay. If there's nothing else around that, then the next thing we have is the workloads API discussions. And by the way, there's a link here to the KEP tracking board.
All right. I can share my screen and put up the tracking board.
Oh, yeah. Please go ahead.
Just a sec. So these are the KEPs that are just associated with SIG Apps. There's actually many other KEPs, but these are just the SIG Apps ones that relate to us. And you can kind of see they're in various states here. The backlog is ones that have come in and are being looked at. If they're under SIG review, it's where the SIG is reviewing and debating and whatnot. Anything that has architecture changes though, API changes or major architecture changes, does need to go to SIG architecture and be reviewed. So like in this case, we're talking about a new pod restart policy. And that's one I was hoping Ken would be here for, but he's having issues getting here today to discuss and debate, because the pod restart policy, it'd be a new API property and a new function. It would be additive, and therefore it needs an API review. Once it gets into an implementable state, like the KEP has agreed to and the SIG has signed off on it, then it moves into in progress, where it can go and be implemented. And once it's implemented, there is another column here, completed, closed, and that's where it would go to. And so right now, we have a number of KEPs in flight in SIG review, things we'd like to discuss here because they have to do with workloads. And some of them are other places, like you can see there's garbage collection stuff, sidecar containers, a number of these things we've done here. The Kubernetes application is one that actually needs to be closed out, but I'm not sure the right way to do it yet. But we'll get that one handled soon. And so then there was the one that was on the agenda for today, which is the new pod restart policy. And this one, I believe, was put in by SIG Node, but it is one that impacts SIG Apps. Let's see. So here's the cap. And the gist of it, if y'all haven't read it yet, is to add a pod restart policy. So right now, containers are restarted, but you won't get things such as an init container happening with that. And so the idea here is to add another restart policy in addition to the ones that are already there to restart the whole pod if a container crashes. And I know Ken had lots of opinions on that. And so if he's not here, we might want to punt on that. Is he here yet?
He's not, no.
Okay. So that's where we stand. Does anyone have any questions about the KEPs that we currently have open or backlog or anything?
So the Kubernetes application KEP, that's the one for the applications CRD, correct?
This is the original one for the Kubernetes native, the application built right into it. And I think it actually takes a minute to load because it was one of those that had so much discussion that it kept causing GitHub to crash. And for quite a while, we couldn't even close it because it gave us an error, a server error, because it was too many comments, too much content. As you can see, 206. And it would come and go when it would work in that. And so it's finally closed, but I'm not sure of the right tracking way to do it because all the tracking right now is manual. So this should be closed. In fact, it is closed, but I'm not sure the right way that Brian and Jace are handling all that tracking at the moment.
Okay.
I don't know if it goes to close completed or whether it just gets removed from the board. I'll get with Jace this week and find out.
Okay, sounds good.
I don't have much more to talk about here. Just Ken usually drives the workloads API stuff, which is what this week is all about workloads API things, unless there's open discussion. There are some other things. There's the sidecar containers, which I think we've talked about here. Garbage collection. Did we talk about this one, Adnan?
I don't remember if we did, no.
So this is something put in by Janet, I want to say. You'll find it. It was written by, Janet, who we won't have here for the next couple of weeks because she may not be around much at the end of this year because she is one of the chairs for the KubeCons. But the general idea here is to add new ways to garbage collect objects. So for example, say you've got secrets that aren't being used that have been left around for months and months. There's no automated way to garbage collect those, or the top level objects that don't have owner references. There's no way to say garbage collection, get these. And quite often stuff gets left around for folks in some situations. And so the idea here is to add mechanisms to say, go garbage collect this. Like maybe it's no longer attached to a pod anymore. garbage collected when it's not needed, you know, after so long a period of it not being in use. And there's some possible issues with that. But if folks are interested, please go dig into this. But the whole idea is giving new ways to garbage collect stuff. And there's a lot of detail in there, implementation detail and cases, and even some discussions around rough edges and proposed changes to this. And the reason it comes up on our board is let's see. Well, it is owned by SIG API machinery. We are participating SIG because it impacts the workloads API. And I believe everything in this would be opt-in to. So it wouldn't make an API change out of the gate. That's that one. We've discussed sidecar containers. Do you remember this one? The identify API usage patterns which applied and throw phylogeny. Do you remember this one? I'll go over it again real quick. We probably need to revisit this one across the board, but the idea here, and this is not workloads API specific, is to try to figure out, it was by Hippie Hacker, try to figure out what APIs are being leveraged where and in what ways within Kubernetes.
This is related to the API Snoop thing that Hippie Hacker was working on. Yep.
Yeah, and the whole idea here is try to figure out what patterns and ways people are using their applications. A way to figure out more detail and understand exactly who's doing what where, and maybe features that aren't being used, maybe features that are being used a lot together in combination, and just gather the data. This one, unfortunately, has not seen much movement in a CAP in the many months that it has been around. We're probably nearing a year. Oh no, this is when it went in July. That I heard about this before it was a CAP. So it's been quite some time. Okay. So this is kind of where we stand. Next time when we come back, we should probably have a good debate on the pod restart policy, unless folks want to go poke at it in the meantime. And the application should be closed out by next time we meet.
Sounds good. And do we plan to review this board every 2 weeks whenever we have the workloads discussion?
I don't know. What do you think? Do you think we should?
Yeah, I think that'd be a good idea.
Okay. And I do have another CAP that's going to go in here soon, I think. So that'll be a new addition for us to debate and discuss.
Cool.
All right.
Okay. Well, we can move on to the open discussion here. So I think, Jordan, this is you push to switch usage to SV1.
Yeah, this is just kind of a FYI for people who are interested or people who are maybe creating new manifests, new clients, new examples out of tree that I might not have visibility to. So in 1.9 is when the apps v1 APIs got released for all the workloads, and the beta versions of those APIs were announced as deprecated. And so when 1.13 comes out, we will be 4 releases out from that deprecation announcement. And that will complete the required deprecation period for beta APIs that have been replaced by a V1 API. And so I am sweeping through and making sure that all of the in-tree clients and components and examples and manifests and add-ons are all using the apps v1 APIs. So I linked a pull request that is just switching over stragglers from apps v1 beta 1 and v1 beta 2 and extensions v1 beta 1, switching those over to use apps v1. So the push for 1.13 is to make sure that everything we are doing and publishing and demonstrating and shipping is using apps v1. The required deprecation period externally is complete as of 1.13, but there were a couple things in kube control that were still using extensions v1 beta 1. And so we still have to support SKU with kube control for another release. So the push for 113 is to make sure that we are using apps v1 everywhere. And then we can, in another probably 2 releases, consider no longer serving the beta versions of those APIs. So this is cleanup work. This is making sure that we are positioned to be able to turn those off by default. We would want to start pre-announcing that probably in 113. Say the target for the beta APIs no longer being served is, for example, 115, similar to what we did with etcd2. Echoing that in the release notes, multiple releases in advance. My intent would be to no longer serve those by default in 115, but obviously, if you had data in etcd in those versions, we would still be able to read that from etcd, so there would be no migration impact. And I would anticipate there being a way to turn those back on if, at least for a few more releases. So we're just trying to move the ecosystem towards the GA versions and communicate that well, make sure that everything that we're demonstrating and documenting is using the supported GA versions of those things. So if you're interested, jump into that PR. I think I tagged Matt and Ken. If you can review or nominate a reviewer, that'd be great. And then just for anyone else who's doing stuff anywhere else in any other repo, please make sure you're using the apps v1 versions.
Wait, am I unmuted?
Yes, you are. We can hear you.
Yeah, Jordan, can you link me the PR? I can give it a review. You already, looks like you moved the internal versions into apps maybe a week ago, right?
Yeah, that was an internal change that had no API visible.
Right. So now for the API, are you just turning them off altogether? Because they were off by default already.
Nope.
Oh, wait, that's right.
They are still on, and they have to stay on by default as long as we are shipping manifests and clients that make use of them, which we still are.
So we are, but you and Sean are both doing PRs against kubectl to get a lot of the stuff that's defaulting into extensions v1 beta 1 out, right?
I saw some of the stuff Sean was doing. I thought he was doing more changes around like internal to external types, not so much extensions to apps, but maybe I missed some of what he was doing.
Well, so no, you are correct, but a lot of that involves the way kubectl's client set is configured in a very strange way. So that even no matter how you configure the API server in terms of exposing the default being apps v1 via the discovery API, for some reason the kubectl client set is always going in and getting the extensions v1 beta 1 by default, which is one of the reasons that we have a lot of the conversions that are going through internal conversion just to convert between extensions and apps v1.
Yeah, I thought most of those got swept out. I can sync up with Sean, but I know there was a lot of work. I saw several PRs switching to external, and so with my PR, as far as I know, all of the ones that are being used are using apps at that point.
Okay, if you give me a link, I'll take a look as soon as possible to get it off. But my only concern is, so I mean, technically we deprecated this a while ago. If we do this at the same time that we remove the dependencies in kubectl, do we break our version SKU compatibility between the client and?
Yeah, I am not proposing turning off the serving in 113.
Okay.
I am proposing turning off serving those in 115.
Okay.
So that's why I'm wanting to make sure that we ship 113 with all of our clients no longer using
before we ship 113 so that we can actually turn it off with a straight face in 115. Makes sense.
Exactly. That's right.
Sounds good. Thanks.
That was all I had.
Cool, thanks. Ken, since you're here, do we want to talk about the pod restart policy kit?
Yeah, give me a second to get in context. I just walked into the room.
Sure, no worries.
I can share my screen again to put it up.
Yeah. So in general, it looks like what they're proposing is to effectively allow you to have different restart policies for different jobs, different containers in the same workload object, in the same pod, basically, in order to allow you to do things like, I think of it in terms of sidecars, but basically it's like, in the event that a particular container terminates, you could put it to restart never, and that container won't ever get restarted. Or you can have one that's restart always, and it disassociates the life cycles of containers that are tied together. Looking at this KEP versus the sidecar KEP, my personal preference is to go with sidecars, because that seems to be the most common use case, and the semantics of that seem to be more well-defined. My only concern with this one is that I can imagine some rather strange behaviors that would be unanticipated. And the other thing is, even if we want to do this, this is almost more, so I mean, from our perspective, it's pod and workload API, but the reality is most of the work to do this would be inside of kubelet. So this is almost a node, more of a node KEP than it is an apps KEP. I mean, I think maybe we might care more about it because we deal more with how the actual workloads are orchestrated, but all the work is going to be in kubelet for the most part, and some API changes.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, that is actually owned by SIG node, and we're just a participating SIG.
Yeah.
So they'd have to approve of this. How would you do this with sidecar containers then? What would you do as a sidecar container to handle, say the case we're using a init container to set up another container, and then that container crashes, and now what do you do with it? Because you can't just restart that container necessarily without the init container going off in all cases. How would you use a sidecar for that situation?
So it doesn't actually cover that one. So if you're saying I have an init container and I'm going to try to restart only one container?
Well, what do you do in that case? Because that's what would happen today. By the way, that is one of the examples. I thought it was one of the examples.
Yeah, I'm not, so with init containers, right? Like if you're saying restart always, but don't rerun the init containers?
No, it's saying right now that'll happen. If a single container crashes in a pod, the whole pod doesn't restart, right? And that's one of the justifications. And they use init containers as an example in the motivation.
Yeah, I mean, but you're not going to be able to tie the life cycle of an init container. So even if the containers are restarted independently, that's still not going to do that, right?
Well, if you restart the whole pod, the init container will run again.
Right. You're trying to not rerun the init container and have one container fail?
No, that's what happens today. Today, with a restart policy, if a single container fails, the whole pod is not restarted. At least that's what.
Correct. You don't rerun the init container. So you're trying to get them to rerun.
Yes, it's trying to get that to rerun when a container, if a container fails, how do you do that?
Well,
and the proposal here is to restart the whole pod, which would cause all of the containers to restart and init containers to rerun, for example.
Wait. Oh wait, this is the opposite. This is going to take the pod level up and try to do the whole thing. So the advice we've been given on that is if you really need this, then run them as separate pods to manage the lifecycle. That's the easy one, right? Like, so if you have a bunch of init containers that are going to run with a particular container, use 2 pods if you need to manage the lifecycle of that independently.
So that way,
you won't get a shared namespace or shared networking in that case.
But here it's suggesting the change is that if the container fails on failure, restart the whole pod rather than an individual container.
What have we heard from SIG node on their take on this? I know I've heard quite a few concerns around sort of layering on complexity on top of a init container lifecycle, it's not in a great place already.
Ready, yeah. But the other thing is I don't understand what problem this actually solves. Like, did they give any examples of a use case where they really can't get something to run because of this?
So the example is, right, let's see if I get the scenario right here. The on failure and always restart policies effectively manage the lifecycle of the containers of a pod. The support for multiple containers in a pod also enable better modularity and separation of concerns between different containers. It also promotes looser coupling between components. Init containers provide some additional support for modularity and looser coupling for the functionality of initializers of the pod. They make it possible to separate the initialization from the rest of the pod to enhance both modularity as well as security. But both the on failure as well as the always restart policies restart the individual containers in question and not the whole pod. This is, for the most part, desirable, even optimal. However, there are scenarios, some documented in this issue, there's a linked issue, where the many containers in a pod, including init containers, might be interlinked or interdependent in such a way as to require closer coordination than any one of its when any one of its containers are restarted. In the issue, talks about rerunning init containers in a deployment when containers exit on error. So if the deployment has a container in it and it restarts and the whole pod doesn't restart, but it relied on an init container, what's the alternative? The init container didn't restart, so the deployment's not going to come back up in its right state because the whole pod needs to be restarted in this setup.
So the sidecar cap doesn't mention init containers.
No, the sidecar cap is more dealing with, so like in daemon sets in particular, jobs in particular, there's a lot of scenarios where you have a particular pod that isn't the main container and you want to manage the lifecycle of that container with respect to the main container, right? Even for deployments, this is the case. And we don't really have any type of order termination where you can say, okay, well, this pod's a sidecar. If it dies, don't take the main container, or this container's a sidecar. If it dies, don't restart this one. There's lifecycle termination semantics where actually saying something is a sidecar has meaning. We have a couple of open issues surrounding that. Looking at this issue, the guys or gal is, I mean, it seems like they're using the init container for what it was intended for, right? They're pulling down something and then formatting it into the file system of the pod itself.
This seems to be wanting a pod to stick around longer than it seems like maybe it should. Like,
yeah.
No,
if
it's actually
the
saying the
init
pod
container-
will stay around. It's saying
Well,
the pod will stay around, though.
It's like they want to re-init everything, but at that point, I guess I'm wondering why wouldn't we consider this pod dead?
But
Like,
we don't today is what they're saying. They're saying today, if you've got, say, 4 containers in a pod, right, and one of the containers crashes, the whole pod is not restarted today, just that one container.
right, and I think that is a misspecified pod. That is a pod that is saying my init container does X, and then from that point on, the rest of my containers can run independently or can coordinate amongst themselves. And
So
they have not set up containers that can actually do that, right?
yeah, going back to init containers, one of the primary use cases for which they were implemented was, so in Docker, you have like the ability to specify a volume image, right? You can specify like, I want this container to be effectively mounted as a volume inside. And we didn't have anything that was nice like that to be able to like take storage and then pre-format it into a volume that's mounted into your pod. So that was like a kind of a primary use case of init containers. Like if you needed to pull down some files or if you needed to run some apt commands in order to actually set up something persistent inside of a volume that your pod is going to use, it helped to solve that problem. But it seems like what they really want is every time the process starts to go fetch a value from some location and then write it to the file system, right? Which isn't really what the init containers were intended to do.
Can't you write it to a volume, and then even if the container restarts, the volume is still there because it's part of the pod?
So if they were using a volume, I'm assuming they're doing something like an empty dir, or they need to refetch every time it starts because it expires. It's kind of vague on that, on what that means. But in any case, the general pattern we see here is what Brian likes to call entry point.sh, where you wrap your, effectively, whatever you're doing for your main process, you exec out to that from a shell script. And whatever you need to do prior to it, you do inside of the script. So in this case, like you'd have a bash script that pulls down this container and then stores it prior to launching the main process. And every time you restart the pod, that entry point script gets called and actually would go through this flow. So, I mean, like the solution to this guy's or this guy or gal's problem would be effectively write a script that does this inside of the pod's entry point and execs out to whatever you're trying to run, and it should just work.
It's like a per container lifecycle hook.
Yeah.
Pre-execute or post-execute. Yeah.
You could also do it that way. You could use a pre-execute script or a post-execute, but those are, well, I need to think more if I can actually say that to be true, but probably you could do that. Or just wrap the entry point in something that does it periodic or does it prior to launching the process. It wasn't really a use case for init containers. And so the question is, do we want init containers to be rerun that way? And like, again, I just kind of feel like with sidecars, I understand how it works and it wouldn't affect the general semantics of what a pod and is today and what an init container is today. It doesn't change any of that. With this, we're kind of changing the API and interface to be something fundamentally different. It's sort of risky, but again, I'm not diametrically opposed to it. I just don't see what the necessity is. And like, it doesn't seem like it solves. So sidecars are something that's frequently requested and solve a bunch of actual like real world use case problems with people like, okay, I can't actually do this because it falls over. You're encouraging me to use mutating webhooks to inject pods into my, or inject containers into my pods for sidecars. Like that's a scenario you say you want to support, and you want to be able to support these applications where the lifecycle, I mean, they were legacy. They weren't written in a way such that they can just die independently of each other. And the sidecar really needs to go down first. I can buy that as something we should go do to solve a problem in usability for the system. I'm just not sure this solves a usability problem.
So how about we do this? Because the question we're getting hung up on here, so the proposal basically says, if a container fails, you can have a restart policy to restart the whole pod rather than just the container. That's what the proposal here is, right? And the scenario, like the documented example, is one we're calling into question as a motivation, right? So maybe we go back and say, are there other motivations, other use cases besides that particular issue to justify a container crashing and restarting the whole pod rather than the container? We're looking for more motivations, right?
Yeah, or is it, I mean, unless the person's saying that they just think that this is more intuitive and more intuitive way to interact with the system, it doesn't seem they're making that argument either.
Yeah, it seems to be, you know, for the scenario such as the one documented. But it was Janet who wrote this, so I would give her patience until probably January to come back with more motivations on it, but we can ask the question.
Yeah, I'd also be interested in seeing kind of the life cycle of init containers.
Oh, no, I'm wrong.
Crisped up a little bit. And
wait, you think this is Janet Cohen?
No. I sorry, I thought her name was, it wasn't Janet. It's, let's go back and ask. I thought I saw her name on it. Where did I see it? No, I'm sorry. I was thinking of a different one at this point. Sorry about that. We can go back and ask him about it. It's SIG Node who owns this, and I don't know. Who that is, but we can I'll go back and ask for the motivation other than that one. I'm happy to take it and go ask for another motivation and then discuss the details of that issue.
Or maybe, I mean, if everybody else in the SIG thinks has a strong desire to do it and thinks that it's a good thing to do, you could always leave that feedback on the KEP as well and say, yeah, well, here's my motivation. I agree with this. And that would be cool too.
Yeah, if anybody here has I don't have a motivation for this at the moment because I haven't run into a problem because I've just entry point or volumes, other things that have not caused this to be a problem for me. But if there are motivations, please post them here because I know that would be helpful for folks. Okay. I'll go ask questions on here. All right.
Great. I think that's all the workflows API discussions that we wanted to talk about, unless there was anything else you wanted to bring up. Okay, any other discussion topics anyone wants to talk about? Otherwise, we can end a few minutes earlier here. Okay, sounds like we can get 19 minutes back to our day. Cool. Well, if there's nothing else, we'll see all of you next week. Or if you're going to KubeCon Shanghai, have fun there. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Have a good one.